Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Pablo Kalmanovitz, a postdoctoral fellow in the Political Science Department at Yale University. He specializes in the political theory of human rights and humanitarianism. Professor Kalmanovitz has written articles and edited volumes on transitional justice, post-war reconstruction, and the regulation of warfare, and he's currently working on a book project on the history of the idea of post-war justice. Today we talk with Professor Kalmanovitz about the research he's done on reparations for war damages. Welcome, Professor Kalmanovitz.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Let's begin with what led you to do this kind of research.
Right. So I was initially attracted by the idea of transitional justice. And transitional justice is a term used to refer to actions taken to come to terms with the past in the context of a regime transition. So a well-known case is Argentina. There was a military junta in Argentina from 76 to 83. And at the end of that junta, when the junta fell, President Raúl Alfonsín came to power. He was democratically elected. And President Alfonsín had to decide what to do with a legacy of massive atrocities, particular disappearances, extrajudicial killings done by the military during the authoritarian regime. So he had to make this really hard decision of what to do about that. And he was really facing a really interesting and difficult dilemma between, on the one hand, securing the transition, making sure that the military would play along and surrender power. But on the other hand, he had to be a defender of the rule of law and democracy. And he had to show all citizens that nobody was going to be above the law, including the military. So he had to prosecute some military, but perhaps not all of them. So there was this really difficult political balance between securing the transition, peace, order, and justice. So that led me to think more generally about the question of how can we say that the end of a given war, in this case a dirty war, is just or acceptable or in some sense decent? And that's the general question that I want to address. And I discovered that this question has a very long history. And it has not always been the case, as it is today, that there's a lot of insistence on prosecutions and reparations and truth commissions. And there's really a very strong movement for coming to terms with the past now. But if you look at that historically, well, it's a rather new thing.
Okay.
So
in your paper, you look, I guess, at the last 20 years or so, and that this is the time when people really begin to look at war reparations. Talk about your paper and give us a little bit of an overview on what you're looking at.
Right. So so this paper is not historical, and I start with what I take to be something like a legal fact, or some people say a soft legal fact. But it is a declaration that the UN General Assembly made in 2005 on the right to a remedy and to reparations. And this is a right that is supposed to apply in virtue of international human rights instruments and the UN Charter in a way to victims of massive violations of human rights. And it's a very ambitious statement of the duty to repair. It includes not only actual harms, but also losses of opportunity and earning that has been missed because of the violations. So it's only counterfactual losses, that are included. And so I took that as a starting point and then contrasted that with the reality of war, which is a lot of destruction, institutional weakness in the states, very scarce resources, like in terms of officers and budget and money and just capacity, state capacity. And I just thought, well, this very ambitious plan or guideline that the UN General Assembly is producing doesn't match the reality of a war. And so I was led to think, okay, so how much can we justify a right of reparations in the context of the aftermath of a war?
When you say it doesn't address the realities of the war, what do you mean by that?
Well, basically that there are a lot of victims of harm, direct or indirect harm, much more than could be repaired via the resources or with the resources that the state has, and also institutional weakness. So states at the end of a war are often well, they have been ravaged by war, and they are institutionally very weak, so not capable of implementing any or very ambitious reparations project. So if you take that into account, those real constraints, political constraints on state action, then you have to give up some of these very high expectations that the General Assembly is introducing in the declaration.
Okay, and then in your paper you talk about normative accounts of corrective justice. So what do you look at in terms of that?
Right, so what I do is I take this legal fact, which is a statement of principle, and then I contrast that with theories of the justice of reparations or corrective justice. And I look at three different approaches. One is a classical standard liberal approach, which says that reparations should be given in order to protect the value of individual autonomy. And the idea is that if you get reparations fairly soon and proportional to the harm you have suffered, then that would protect it would minimize the level of damage or how upset your plans are by the harm. So the idea is the quicker you get reparations and the more equal those reparations are to the harm you suffer, the better you can carry on with the life you want to have. So that's individual autonomy. And what I do what I say from that standpoint is often harm is the rule rather than the exception in war cases. So a lot of people, if not a majority of people, have been harmed. So it is impossible to recover the status quo ante situation for people. It is impossible to uphold autonomy in the way that this liberal theory wants to uphold it. So we have to, in a way, accept the tragic reality of war and the destruction and the irreparable, really, effect of war on people's lives, and perhaps instead of looking back, coming to terms via reparations, look forward and think, okay, what's necessary for people to recreate their lives in a decent, more or less egalitarian way. So that's what I do, especially in the second approach that I look at, which is a theory of property, which is, again, very influential in the liberal tradition, goes back to John Locke. And what I argue there is exactly that, is that if the most, or a very plausible theory of property would tell us, prioritize giving everybody an equal opportunity to reconstruct their lives in the aftermath of war. Not so much make sure that past entitlements are observed or respected, but more give everyone a chance to start a new life after the war on equal terms. And finally, the third approach I look at is the idea of reestablishing a well-functioning market. This is not really a theory of justice, it's more a problem of coordination or institutional creation of a well-institutionalized market. And one finding that I have that I think is interesting is that this is the account that gives more weight to a program of reparations. And the idea is not so much about justice, but more about social coordination in the sense of, if we want a well-functioning market after a war, then we need to have a focal point that tells us who has what at the end of a war, who is the owner of what good. And so the past provides that focal point in a way. We know who owns what because that's the way it used to be. But the claim is not really about justice, but more about coordination. And there are aspects of justice involved. If we believe that markets are good for people, it's a good way of distributing resources or producing more. But really, it's about knowing who owns what in order to move forward.
Okay, and what are you suggesting in terms of reparations and the best way to move forward? And in particular, can you use your theory in terms of a particular war?
Well, so basically, I guess the main message is healthy doses of skepticism about this like backward-looking emphasis in recent discourse. There are good reasons to be less focused on the past and more focused on the future, on reconstruction, and that may mean sacrificing past entitlements. But what I'm arguing is that that doesn't seem so serious or so grave morally. Another, I think, important or contribution that I want to make is to look at war, at the tragedy of a war. Like a lot of this discourse sometimes seems to have this hope of erasing the effects of a war, going back before the time of the war. And well, that's not possible. And so there's a message of also just soberly accepting the losses. And finally, there's also this connection between reparations and private property and the market, which is there, but it's not often made explicit. And I think it's a really interesting connection, and it's something worth discussing and thinking about. If a private property regime is the only acceptable way that a country should adopt at the end of a war. Maybe there's collective property or traditional uses of property, and those are worth thinking about also. Now, turning to like actual cases, so there are two cases I guess I would talk about. And
okay, good. It's good just to talk specifics,
right?
Because it gives people a good idea, really, of what you're talking about.
Right. So the first one is Colombia, and okay. I'm from Colombia, and this is really the case that got me started with all this. So recently, Colombia has passed a very ambitious land restitution law in Congress, and there's been a huge problem of internal displacement in the country. About between 3.5 and 5 million people has been internally displaced, which is a good chunk of the whole population, about 10%.
And how has it been displaced?
So basically, there's been an armed conflict going on for decades.
Okay. And is it still going on?
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
And one of the strategy of the armed actors has been to push people outside of their region. So thinking that they're supporting the other side, or just because they want to appropriate their land, or people just run away because they're scared. So it may be intentional or non-intentional, but the effect of this country this war has been huge, massive displacement, or a wave of forced migration to the cities, from the countryside to the cities. And now the government and the Congress, they want to implement this law to give back the land to people who have lost it, and in a way create incentives for them to return to the countryside.
I'm sorry, but if the war is still going on, this armed conflict is still going on,
right.
Why did the people move from the country to the city? Is it because it's safer in the city?
Right.
Okay, so if they move back to the country and the conflict is still going on, how is that going to help them?
It's not clear.
Okay.
Right, so one perhaps the main objection or preoccupation with this law is how are you going to protect these people if they return, because the war is not over indeed. Right. So the government is making efforts, but it's very clear that it still doesn't have the power, the capacity to really guarantee security for returnees. Okay. So there is that. There's also the fact that people may not have jobs when they come back, so irrigation systems, roads, markets in the countryside may have been lost or destroyed or eliminated by the war. And so there's this very hard dilemma, like should the government invest in returning for these people, or should it rather create opportunities for them to resettle in cities and become urbanites? So that's a case, and what my theory would say is something like, well, they should be given the opportunity, but the emphasis on returning perhaps shouldn't be as high. And perhaps there should be a sober acceptance of the weakness of the government and the fact of the state, really, and the fact that they cannot really create order and security in the countryside. And then a second best option would be to provide them with all the resources necessary to make a living in the city. So it's accept the sad fact that the government, the state, has no control in all areas, and give the best possible opportunities to people who are in the cities as settlers to become established and have a good life there.
Now, how does your theory work when it's not all taking place in one country, where it's two different countries warring?
Yeah. So that's in this particular paper, I don't look at that case. I keep it all within one state, because the international case is hard because there is the issue of interstate reparations. And right now, so there is some principles that say that an aggressor state has to pay reparations to the injured state, but that kind of consideration I'm not really looking at in this piece.
Okay, and did you have another country you could cite in terms of specifics?
Right, so there's another interesting case, which is East Timor.
Okay.
And what has happened in East Timor is really, it's a really complicated situation, because so East Timor was a Portuguese colony until the, I don't remember, like early 70s. then the Portuguese left and Indonesia invaded the country. And there was this occupation that was, Indonesia claimed that they had just incorporated East Timor to their state, but the East Timorese didn't accept that, and the international community didn't accept that. And so there was a referendum in, I think, 2000.
But didn't a mass genocide took place in that country, correct?
It was, no, well, so what happened is that there was this referendum, and the East Timorese overwhelmingly said, we want independence. And when the Indonesians were leaving, they destroyed everything. There was this huge, especially material destruction, but also massive rapes and killings, and it was a really barbaric way of living the country. And East Timor is already a very poor place, so it was, among other things, they destroyed the land registry, so nobody knew who owned what. So, and then there was a really difficult challenge with drugs. So there was a UN administration came in to basically perform as a state, as a government. And they had to decide, okay, how are we going to repair, to give people back their land? But the difficulty is that, do we look all the way back to the Portuguese times of, when the Portuguese were the masters, or do we look at a land owning when the Indonesians were occupying, or do we look at traditional relationship with the land? So there are 3 different layers of title. And basically, they don't know. And there's been a lot of, or some work trying to go back to Portuguese times, but that to me seems counterintuitive and unnecessary, really. And so my take on that would be, no, emphasize the present and try to create conditions that would make people who are there now have a good life. And again, don't look to the past. So,
but let me ask you this: if I was living in East Timor and I had 20 acres of land, for instance, and my neighbor only had 10 acres of land, right, how do you care for that situation? Because if now we're trying to make everything not go back as far, how can I be assured as the one who owns the more land that I will still have that? Or does that just go out the window and everyone will be given an equal amount of land?
Well, so there is a worry that if you do that, like equalize land completely, you would create a lot of uncertainty and chaos, and people, it will be very hard to know what you have, and that goes back to this idea of restoring the market. If you do that, then you undermine the market, and you will create a lot of resistance probably, from people who own more.
Right.
So probably you cannot do that really. So there's a constraint on that, and I think the constraint comes from the need to have some level of certainty.
Okay.
But on the other hand, if you have 20 acres, your neighbor has 10, and you decided to leave the country, let's say you went to Europe, to Portugal, I don't know, and you haven't been back in years, and then you hear that the Indonesians have left, and you say, well, maybe I should go back, reclaim my land.
Right.
I think if you have been away for so long, and you are not living in East Timor, and you just want to have the land in order to rent it or something, then I would say your claim is weak, and maybe your neighbor should have more land because he's there and he's working, or maybe other people who are landless should have your land because they are willing and able to work it. So there are some. So I propose a more nuanced balance, like a blanket, nullification of all property, and everyone will have the same. But it's more like, what's your commitment? What is your present situation? What are you planning to do with this land? So I think those things are important.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Tell me how the work you've done on war reparations fits into your larger book project.
So it's interesting because in a way, one important component of this work I'm doing is to trace the history of this idea of war reparations, and so I begin in the 16th century. Basically, there's these Spanish natural law theorists who were the ones who basically began to think about just war and what is a just war. They also thought about what is a post-war, a just post-war context, and they said that in the case of a war, if your property or yourself have suffered harm or damage, then you had to put up with it. It was bad luck, and the burden of reconstructing or fixing that should be on you. Like there is no duty to repair in the state. There is talk of a duty to repair later, more in the 18th century, and it's put under the umbrella of social solidarity. There should be a solidarity in the state such that if someone had suffered harm, then fellow citizens will help. And it works as a, you could see it as an insurance mechanism, more or less as when a natural catastrophe hits, there's solidarity and you help. I mean, you were spared, but another one was not.
Yes, so that's a good example. Let me just clarify, you're still talking about within an individual country, not countries against countries.
Well, in that case, so to the extent that a country, let's say in an international war, if an aggressor doesn't have the means to fully repair all the damages that it has caused, then there has to be some level of reconstruction inside the state. So even if there's some level of international reparations, probably you need to resort to social solidarity of some sort, because the destruction outmatches the ability to reconstruct. States are typically don't have those resources, or wars typically are more destructive than that. So even in that case, there is probably an appeal to social solidarity. But in the 18th and 19th century, it was like a weak principle. It's not. They typically say this is not part of international law. It's more a duty of morality, and it should be done. To put that to do that in international law, and to say it should go as far as lost opportunities, that's a really new development. And it's much more ambitious than the people in the 18th and 19th century were. And I am actually a bit skeptical. I think they are too ambitious. They are too utopians, if you want. And probably something closer to the 19th century model seems more plausible and acceptable.
More realistic?
Right.
Now, in doing your research, in addition to the actual political theories around reparations, are you looking at what actually happened in each country and incorporating that into your work? Well,
so far not as much. I've been looking more at the theories, but I want to do that. I want to look
because that would be very interesting to see what the theory are and what actually was applied.
What the practice was.
Right.
So that's part of my agenda.
Well, good luck with that, and thank you so much for being here with us and sharing some of your work.
Thank you.
For more information about Professor Kalmanovitz, please visit our webpage at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.